00111. Magneto the hero? Ezekiel scrambled, typing furiously on his computer as the others talked in the background, and watched the news report playing on screen. It took a few minutes, but Ezekiel finally found what he was looking for, and some new information pulled up on the screen. It showed the flight path of the airplane that crashed into the building. It originally took off from a private airfield in Canada, followed by a few other planes. Tracking data appeared for the other planes. One was almost to New York City. The other two were flying towards Washington, D.C. Ezekiel glanced at the rest of the room as he said, I think we should send Magneto in to handle the plane going to New York. Wouldn't that lead to Hydra targeting Magneto and Genosha when the world learns he took it over? Asked Jarvis. Ezekiel nodded as he said, that's the idea. Since Hydra really wants to start a global war on terrorism, we'll give them a reason to be cautious instead. Ezekiel pointed at the screen and said, the entire world is going to be focused on this. If we let Magneto stop the next plane live, for the world to see, he becomes a hero. Ezekiel glanced around the room again as he said, we can also let him take credit for helping with the hijacked airplanes. Afterwards, he can announce to the world that he is the new ruler of Genosha, along with the reasons why, and no one will bat an eye. Fury nodded in agreement before he said, I hate to admit it, but that could work. Ezekiel smiled as he said, good, because we have about 10 minutes to decide if we're actually going to do this. Ezekiel looked at his fellow council members as he asked, anyone have any objections? When no one spoke up, Ezekiel keyed up his comm unit and said, Squad 1, do you copy? White Fang here. Go ahead. Tell Mordo to make a portal in front of the World Trade Center towers in New York City. Magneto needs to stop a plane from crashing into the buildings. It should be there in about 10 minutes. Copy. What about us? Should we help? Ezekiel glanced at the flaming tower for a few moments before he said, yes. There is a massive fire on the upper floors of the South Tower, and people are trapped above it. You'll need to rescue the people trapped on the upper floors. Copy. What about the fire? Should we put it out? Ezekiel glanced at the fire again before he said, I don't know if you can. It's being fed by 40,000 gallons of jet fuel. There was a confident tone in White Fang's voice as he said, we'll take care of it. Ezekiel typed on his computer as he said, good, and leave the prisoners where you are now. I'm sending a backup team to pick them up. Roger, White Fang out. Ezekiel pulled up the other two planes which seemed to be heading towards the capital and tried to confirm their trajectories. As Ezekiel worked, Peggy asked, what should we do with the other two planes? Ezekiel glanced up for a moment as he continued to type and said, I have no idea, but we have about half an hour to figure it out. A news reporter was heard from the main screen as they said, a new development just happened. We are going to Jason, who is live on the scene. The news broadcast on the main monitor changed to show Squad 1 as they worked to put out the fire on the South Tower. Magneto seemed to be the camera's main focus though as he floated in front of the towers. It looked like he was also trying to help put out the fire as he scanned the area, looking for the next plane. As the camera zoomed back out, the reporter's voice asked, Jason, can you tell us and our viewers what's happening? The camera moved slightly to show a disheveled news reporter on a rooftop with a view of the towers behind him. He smiled weakly for the camera as he said, moments ago, the mutant known as Magneto appeared along with the masked people you can see in the background. They seem to be evacuating people trapped in the building and trying to put out the fire. Has Magneto? The news reporter was interrupted as a cloud of smoke appeared close by. It was Kurt and 3 people who he just teleported out of the building. The cameraman was quick to react and focused on the new people as Kurt disappeared in another cloud of smoke. The news reporter moved towards the new arrivals and asked, are you all right? Before they could answer, another puff of smoke appeared as Kurt teleported 2 new people over. As Kurt disappeared, one of the people sat down on the ground and said, I am now. Over the next 5 minutes, Kurt repeatedly transported people out of the building onto the nearby rooftop. Just as he appeared again, everyone heard a plane approaching. It was the cameraman who reacted first and turned to see the plane. As the camera focused in on the plane, the cameraman could be heard as he said, are they going to? As the plane approached, it started to slow down slightly before balls of metal slammed into its engines. Once the engines were destroyed, the metal spread out covering portions of the plane and slowed it to a stop. The cameraman quickly switched his focus to Magneto, who was floating in the air, as he watched the plane for a moment. Then he started to move the plane away from the buildings and towards the airport. As Magneto moved away, the news reporter could be heard as he said, I've never seen anything more incredible in my life. Ron, did you catch all of that? Yeah. Back at base, Ezekiel smiled as he watched the news and said, all right, New York is secure and the fire is almost out. Ezekiel typed on the computer and pulled up the other two planes as he asked, how should we handle the other planes? Fury spoke up first and said, we should send Magneto. It will garner more goodwill and just improve his overall image. Ezekiel glanced at everyone else for a few moments. When no one voiced disagreement, he keyed up his microphone and asked, Squad 1, do you copy? White Fang here, go ahead. Ezekiel typed on his computer as he said, I am sending you information on the other two planes. Share it with Mordo so he can portal Magneto out there to stop them. Roger that. There was a short pause before White Fang said, all civilians are rescued and the fire is almost contained. What are our next orders? Ezekiel studied the news report for a bit before he said, quickly sweep both towers for bombs. If you find nothing, have Mordo portal you back to base with Magneto. Roger, White Fang out. Ezekiel glanced at the other people in the room and said, while Magneto takes care of the other two planes, we need to come up with some ideas on what he can say to the media. Anyone have some good ideas? You really think Hydra planted bombs in the towers? Steve asked. Ezekiel looked over to Steve as he said, no idea, but it's better to double-check, just in case. Who knows what other backup plans they might have in place. Time passed quickly as everyone went over ideas for Magneto's speech. Over half an hour later, Squad 1 along with Magneto were finally back at base. Luckily, no bombs were found in the buildings, and they brought along the other pilots to interrogate. As Magneto took his normal seat at the table, Kurt and Kitty were led back into the room. They were dressed in their normal clothes again and looked a little exhausted from saving so many people. Ezekiel greeted them both with a smile before he said, first off, I would like to thank you for your help today. You both helped us a lot and saved a lot of lives in the process. Kurt rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment as he said, we're just glad we could help out. Kitty nodded her head as she said, it was fun being able to use our powers to help other people. Ezekiel glanced at Xavier as he said, well, hopefully you can help us out again sometime. But I would ask that both of you keep any information about us a secret. Ezekiel pointed at the news channel as it showed more footage of Kurt transporting people out of the buildings and said, I am sure people will notice who Kurt is from his unique powers and tail. If people ask, you can tell them you helped Magneto with the rescue. But don't tell them about us, this place, or the people you worked with. Yes, sir. Both kids said it almost the same time. Ezekiel smirked and said, you guys can relax. Also moving forward, you're both allowed to visit here as guests. Just ask Logan, Storm, Beast, or the professor here, and we'll transport you over. Both kids smiled as Kurt said, thank you. You're welcome. Now before you head back home, is there anything either of you would like? I know you both helped out because it was the right thing to do. But I also believe in being paid for your work, and you both worked hard today. Both of them looked at each other and couldn't really think of anything they would want. When they looked back at Ezekiel, he just smiled and said, no need to rush, just think about it. Both kids nodded as Shursway stepped forward and said, I'll take you back to the portal room. After the kids walked out, discussion picked back up on what to do about Magneto and the coming press conference that Ezekiel scheduled in about an hour with major news networks. As that was going on, Fury's phone, which had been going off most of the day, finally rang with a different ringtone. As the Imperial March played loudly through the room, everyone quieted down so Fury could answer his phone. As Fury answered the phone, he patched it through to the room's speakers so everyone could hear and said, go ahead. What the hell are you doing, Fury? Why haven't you contacted me on what's going on? Fury schooled his face and said, I've been busy managing the situation the best I can. I was going to contact you once my teams had a better grasp on everything that's happened today. A better grasp on the situation? We had 8 planes hijacked today. How in the hell did that fly under the radar? On top of that, all of them were going to be flown into buildings. What the hell am I supposed to tell the World Security Council? Fury gritted his teeth before he slowly said, no idea, sir. I am personally looking into how we missed something like this. Don't bother with that. I'll have Garrett dig into it. I need you for something else that takes priority. We need to deal with that terrorist Magneto. We need to figure out a way to arrest him, or at least discredit him. Discredit or arrest him. But he helped stop all the planes, and even helped rescue people from the building. The man chuckled before he said, "You might be losing your edge, Nick. Just think about it. He shows up out of the blue and saves the day, but he also took all of the hijackers with him. He was getting rid of evidence. There is a good chance he was behind the whole thing." All the metal in the room creaked slightly as Magneto frowned at the accusation. Xavier placed a comforting hand on Magneto's shoulder as Fury said, "I honestly have no idea how I could arrest someone like Magneto, sir, but I am open to suggestions if you have any." As for discrediting him, as far as the world is concerned, the man looks like a hero right now. Well, do what you do best and find some dirt on him. I don't care if you have to make something up, but he needs to be taken care of. We can't let the world think he is some kind of hero. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Good. Also, I need a full report on what happened today on my desk by tomorrow. I'll need it for my report to the World Security Council. And send any info you found about today to Garrett. Understood. Great. I'll talk to you later, Nick. There was a click as the phone hung up and Fury said, "Goddamn fucking snake." 00112, Magneto King of Genosha. It was nearing sunset in Genosha as multiple portals opened up and allowed a bunch of news reporters, along with their camera crews, access to the island. They were greeted by a large meeting room with an amazing view of an island and the beach not far away in the distance. Every person in the room was especially invited to interview Magneto after his actions earlier in the day. Each and every one of them was considered one of the best in their field, and it was rare to have so many of them gathered together in one place. Minutes passed as they took in the amazing view and talked quietly among themselves. After 10 minutes or so, the main door to the room opened up. As Magneto stepped into the room, everyone quieted down and looked at the young man who entered. Magneto smiled at everyone and said, "First, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. I am sure you have many questions and I will gladly answer as many of them as I can. If you'll follow me, we've set up an area where you can conduct your interviews." One of the more famous and slightly pompous of the reporters asked, "You're going to answer our questions?" I was promised an interview with Magneto, not a teenager. Magneto laughed hard for a few moments. After he calmed down, he said, "I am Magneto. Now, no more questions for now, just follow me." Every person in the room held back from calling the young man a liar, but most of them knew the first question they wanted to ask. Magneto led everyone out of the room and through a few hallways until they moved into a new room. The room was massive in design and built to make anyone who entered it feel small. The oppressiveness of the room was only overshadowed by the white monolith that sat in the middle of the room. The monolith was enormous and shaped like an Egyptian obelisk. Etched into what seemed to be a single piece of white marble were names. Not just a few, but tens of thousands of names were etched into the object. Everyone seemed to slow their pace slightly as they walked past the monument and saw the small plaque near the base that read, "In memory of the Genoshan people, your sacrifice will never be forgotten." After they exited that room, they moved through a few more hallways before they exited the building. Outside, they were greeted by a small area set up for an interview with chairs set up for Magneto and each reporter. A few other people were already there and greeted everyone before showing them where they could set up. Magneto moved to his chair and waited patiently for everyone to get in place. Once everything was set, he nodded to the reporters and said, "I understand that this is a little different than a normal interview, but I'm a busy man and don't have the time to do individual interviews with all of you." Magneto spread his arms wide and said, "Since that is the case, I set this up. I will give all of you 3 hours of my time. Please take the next 10 to 20 minutes to organize yourselves and your questions, as I would rather not waste time answering the same questions over and over again. Once you are all ready, your 3-hour window will begin." All of the reporters quickly started to talk amongst themselves, trying to figure out who would ask what questions. It took about 15 minutes, but they decided they would each ask one question at a time. Once everyone asked a question, they would start again. As for who would go first, they decided that with coin flips. Once everyone was in their seats and the cameras were rolling, the first reporter asked, "You told us earlier you were Max Eisenhardt, better known to the world as Magneto. While you look a little like him, everyone knows that Magneto is close to 80 years old and you're a teenager. Can you tell us where Magneto is and when he will be showing up?" Magneto smiled before he said, "I admit, being this young again is a little weird for me. You have no idea how hard it is to control myself sometimes while I have teenage hormones running through my body. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm Magneto." Everyone wanted to ask the same question, but their professionalism stopped them from acting out. That didn't stop them all from turning to look at the person who was allowed to ask the next question with a little bit of jealousy. The woman smiled as she asked, "If that's true, may I ask how you were able to reverse the aging process?" Magneto nodded as he said, "I personally don't know how it works myself, but some very smart people I know figured it out. They showed me proof it worked and then offered me the chance to extend my life." The next reporter asked, "Is there a chance they might offer this service to other people?" Magneto shrugged his shoulders as he said, "I honestly have no clue. I was surprised they offered me the chance in the first place, if I am being honest." The next reporter decided to ask one of the questions they originally wanted to know and asked, "Earlier today you, along with some help, were able to stop a major terrorist attack on the US. Some rumors have been going around that you possibly had a hand in that attack with how quickly you responded to the crisis. How would you like to respond to those allegations?" Magneto smiled wide as he said, "Simple. We didn't know about them. We knew there would be some type of attack, and we responded to the first planes that were hijacked immediately. Unfortunately, we didn't know about the second set of planes." The next reporter followed up and asked, "How did you know there would be an attack in the first place? Were you tipped off by someone, or are the rumors true?" Magneto shook his head as he said, "No. One of my team members has the ability of precognition. It's the reason we were able to be as effective as we were today." From there, the interview dived into more in-depth questions about the day's events, the help Magneto had, and what his team did with the terrorist. There were other questions here and there about other less important things. But a random and somewhat simple question derailed the rest of the interview and changed how it should have ended. One of the reporters who ran out of good questions to ask decided to change it up and asked, "You said before we started you only had limited time for an interview. As far as I know, you've pretty much disappeared from the world for the past year or more. Could you inform us of why that is?" Magneto nodded and gestured to everything around him as he said, "I was helping to build my kingdom and make sure my people were safe." Everyone paused to look at each other for a few moments before the next reporter hurriedly asked, "Could you elaborate on that for us? What is your kingdom's name and where is it exactly if you don't mind us asking?" "It's called Genosha and it's a small island off the coast of Africa. As for how I came to acquire it, it's simple. I killed the old leaders of the country and freed the citizens they kept as slaves. The white Egyptian obelisk we walked past early was built in memory of the slaves who unfortunately couldn't be saved." From there, the reporters just couldn't stop themselves from asking endless questions about the island and what happened. Magneto decided to end the interview there and offered the reporters the chance to explore the island with a camera crew all day tomorrow. They would be given a host to act as a guide and free rein to explore wherever they wanted. Of course, everyone was happy and agreed to Magneto's offer before they left for the day. VVVVV. The interview aired on most networks that night and ended up having some of the highest ratings for a news-related broadcast to date. But one thing that was on everyone's mind was how Magneto was the new ruler of a small island nation. A lot of people came out with crazy conspiracy theories about how it happened, when it happened, and why it might have happened. Besides conspiracy theories, UN officials and other governments with ties to the old Genosha government were up in arms about the country being taken over. Some government officials were already pushing for actions to be taken against Magneto and his new Genosha. Boycotts and military action were just a few of the things being discussed within hours of the news breaking. But just a short 24 hours later, and everything changed. All of the bad press, the talk of possible sanctions, boycotts, and military action disappeared. Instead, everyone was praising Magneto while still going over all the evidence of the old Genosha government's actions he provided. It was almost enough to make the world, and to a greater extent the US, forget about the terrorist attack that happened only a couple days ago. While everyone was focused on Magneto and Genosha, a little-known terrorist group came out and claimed responsibility for the hijackings. It pulled focus back to the recent attacks and to what the US government planned to do going forward. The US president came out later in the day and announced they were going to fight a global war on terror and called for their allies to join them. As Theo watched the announcement, he let out a sigh before he turned back to his training. He was hoping they might have changed the course of history, but it looks like even with most of the disaster averted, Hydra was still able to succeed in their plans for war. Theo spent the next hour practicing his chakra control on his rock wall before he changed into Ezekiel. He glanced at Tao and Agatha as he said, "I'll be back in a few hours for magic training. I need to check in with Tony." Agatha smiled as she said, "Have fun on your play date." Ezekiel held himself back from responding as he made a portal. It took him about half an hour before he appeared in Tony's lab carrying food. Ezekiel glanced over to see Tony, who was currently focused on a new project as music blared through the speakers. Ezekiel set down the food before he walked next to Tony and hit the spacebar on his computer. As the music cut off, Tony looked up to see who it was and couldn't help but smile. He stood up from his seat as he said, "You always have perfect timing. I'm starving." "You wouldn't be starving if you didn't lose track of time," Ezekiel said. Tony waved the comment off as he moved to go through the bags of food. Ezekiel shook his head before he hit the security button and decided to look over what Tony was currently working on. A couple of projects were open on Tony's computer. Most of them were new weapons. But one of them caught Ezekiel's eye, and it was named JRVIS. Ezekiel explored the coding for a few moments before Happy burst into the room. When Happy saw Ezekiel, he put his gun away and moved towards Tony as he said, "Can you not hit the panic button whenever you show up?" Ezekiel pointed at the button as he asked, "That's a panic button? I thought it was the button used to call you when dinner was here. Why the hell would Tony even make a button like that?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "No idea, but it seems to work whenever I press it. Because you always bring food." Tony chuckled slightly as he watched Ezekiel messing with Happy. Happy, for his part, decided to drop it and pulled out one of the boxes. As Tony and Happy started digging into dinner, Ezekiel glanced over his shoulder as he asked, "You're trying to make an AI?" Tony finished a bite of his cheeseburger before he said, "It's not AI. It's just a rather very intelligent system." "Your naming sucks." Tony frowned as he said, "Give me a break. It was the best way to name it, Jarvis." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, it's not. You just make an AI and then give them a name. You don't have to make some weird acronym with words to give them a name." Tony nodded his head as he swallowed his next bite of food before he said, "You're acting like building an AI or something close to an AI is easy." Ezekiel had a faraway look as he said, "It's not. It takes years of work and tens of thousands of coding hours to make something even remotely close to AI. Even then, it still takes a moment of pure brilliance to figure out the missing piece and have everything come together and work." Tony dropped his food to the floor as he looked at Ezekiel and said in an excited voice, "You actually made an AI." Ezekiel broke out of his memories to see Tony getting up from his chair as he asked, "Where's your AI? Can I meet it?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Unfortunately, you can't meet my kids currently." "Kids? You made more than one? Why can't I meet them? Is that why your programming is so good? It's made by AI." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "I don't feel like explaining it to you. Plus, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. As for my programming, it's good because I made it." Tony was going to press for more information when Ezekiel said, "Tell you what, if you finish up those cell tower transceivers in a week, so we can start testing them, I'll help you improve the coding for Jarvis. Sound good?" "Deal." Tony moved next to his computer and pulled up some schematics as he said, "Here they are, and I already have 5 of them being built so we can test them." Tony flashed a big smile at Ezekiel as he asked, "When can you start helping me with Jarvis?" 00113. A deal with Fury. As some of the world powers started to gear up for war, Theo decided to move forward with an idea he'd been thinking about for a while now. But he would need something special to be able to pull it off correctly, which meant he needed to acquire something important. Instead of stealing it, Theo decided to just go to the source and set up a meeting with Fury. While he was in his personal office at the base, he sent a private message to Fury before he waited for him to arrive, while he worked on the software for the cellular transmitters. After a little over 3 hours, Fury finally arrived and sat down in front of Ezekiel's desk. Ezekiel looked up with a smile as he said, "Thanks for joining me. I hope I didn't interrupt anything." Fury shook his head and said, Nothing important. Just a bunch of useless work by the WSC and Pierce that want it done before the US and its allies invade Iraq. I still can't believe they convinced people that Iraq is any type of a threat, even after I posted evidence that said differently. Ezekiel said. Fury focused on Ezekiel as he asked, "Let's cut the bullshit here. Why did you ask to talk with me?" "I need to borrow something you have." Ezekiel said. "No." Ezekiel frowned as he said, "You don't even know what I want." "Doesn't matter. The answer is no." Fury said as he sat back in his chair. "You know I could have just stolen what I wanted? You know why I didn't." Ezekiel said. Fury raised an eyebrow as he asked, "Because Peggy and I would have chewed you out?" Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Because we're allies and we're supposed to help each other out." Fury smiled the tiniest bit as he said, "Glad you finally figured it out. So can you help me out?" Fury smirked as he said, "Only if you help me out first." "The new body I made for you doesn't count as help?" Fury shook his head as he said, "Besides the eye, my old body was just fine. So no, I don't count my new body as help." Ezekiel crossed his arms over his chest as he said, "Fine. Tell me what you want help with. But keep in mind that if we don't come to an agreement, I'll just steal what I need from S.H.I.E.L.D., because as far as I'm concerned, S.H.I.E.L.D. is basically Hydra right now." Fury frowned as he asked, "And what exactly do you need to borrow anyways?" Ezekiel smiled as he shook his head and said, "You'll know if we come to a deal. Plus, I don't want you trying to hide it if our talks fall through." Fury nodded in respect as he said, "At least you're learning. Tao's been a good teacher. Now what do you want?" Fury pulled out a folder and handed it over to Ezekiel as he asked, "Read that first." Ezekiel picked up the thin folder and opened it up to see some confidential Stark Tech files. They contained some information on the project Tony and Ezekiel were currently working on. Nothing important tech-wise was in the files, but it did outline possibly creating a new branch of the company to serve as a cellular service provider. Ezekiel looked up from the file and asked, "Okay, so what do you want?" "You said before you were helping Tony make cell phones and tablets. I assume you are doing the software side of things, which would also include doing all the networking?" Fury asked. Ezekiel nodded and said, "Yes, I have my side of things almost done. We are just stress testing Tony's hardware for any issues, and I'm currently optimizing the code. Then we'll be going into production mode." Fury tapped the folder and said, "I want a backdoor into the system you are putting in place. I assume you are going to spy on everyone who uses your software just like everyone who uses Vibe." Ezekiel let out a hearty laugh as he leaned forward, clutching his stomach. Fury instantly frowned at the reaction and asked, "What's so funny?" In between laughs, Ezekiel said, "You." Fury narrowed his eyes as he watched Ezekiel laugh. It took about a minute for Ezekiel to stop and catch his breath before he said, "I'm not giving anyone access to that type of unfiltered data, especially not a paranoid super spy like you." Ezekiel focused his gaze on Fury as he said, "I want to tell you to fuck off for even asking, but I should have expected it coming from you. So I'll give you another chance." Fury pulled out another folder and set it on the table as he said, "It was worth a shot. I brought this just in case." Ezekiel picked up the folder and started to look it over. After a few minutes, he placed the folder down as he said, "This is actually doable, but I'm letting you know now. I'll know everything that you use it for." Fury frowned as he said, "That isn't what I asked for." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You're right. You just asked for a custom-built program that you can use to hack into basically anything. I admit, I might be a little too trusting, but I'm not stupid." Fury. Ezekiel pulled out a small flash drive from his desk and said, "You basically want one of these for personal use." Fury glanced at the drive for a few moments before he asked, "And what's the issue with that?" "Well, you thinking I am stupid enough to give you something like this without some type of restrictions or oversight. There's also the fact you think this can do everything you want it to do. I'm great at what I do, Fury, but even I have limits." Ezekiel placed the flash drive down and started to type on his computer as he said, "Let me show you something." After a couple moments, Ezekiel spun his screen to Fury and showed him a detailed diagram of the flash drive and said, "As you can see, these things might be powerful computers I made with the help of Hank's PIM particles. But their main design purpose is to connect to my servers. That's where the heavy lifting takes place. I thought you were some kind of genius coder, and most security was a joke to you? Ezekiel nodded and smiled slightly as he said, while I might make it look easy, I put a lot of effort and prep time into everything I do to make it seem that way. I have clones compiling new code every day, improving our systems and defenses, while also improving the ways I slip through everyone's cybersecurity and remain hidden. Ezekiel picked up the flash drive again and held it towards Fury as he asked, "You can have this one if we have a deal. I won't make a deal unless you tell me what you want." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Come on, you already know what I want. Plus, if I have it, Hydra won't be able to get it." Fury frowned again as he asked, "What do you want it for?" "Besides protecting it, I want to try something with it, and Tao and Agatha have already agreed to help with the project." Fury raised one of his eyebrows as he asked, "And what exactly would this project be?" "Just exploring a few places normal portals can't go to. Mostly different planes that are normally locked or hard to enter without knowing the proper way inside," Ezekiel said. Fury stayed quiet for about a minute before he reached forward and took the flash drive from Ezekiel. As he placed the drive in his pocket, he said, "You'll have to figure out a way to replace it with a fake. We don't want people asking questions when it goes missing." Ezekiel smirked and pulled out a plain-looking briefcase from behind his desk and opened it up facing towards Fury as he asked, "You've seen the real thing before? You think this will fool people?" It was the first time Ezekiel saw Fury display anything close to shock. Well, if he was being honest, it was just a slight twitching of Fury's lip, but he would take it. Fury closed the briefcase as he said, "Give me a few days and I'll get you the Tesseract." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Pleasure doing business with you." Fury nodded before he walked out of the room with the briefcase in hand. VVVVV. True to his words, Fury brought Ezekiel the Tesseract within a couple days. The first order of business Tao and Agatha did was to create a suppressing array for the space stone hidden inside of the Tesseract. They created it with the help of the ley lines found in Genosha. It was hidden in a chamber underneath the school they created on the island. It only took them a couple of days with Theo and his clones acting as helpers. He didn't help with the actual spell or creation of the array, but he would bring them whatever materials they needed as they built it. Once the array was completed, they removed the space stone while inside the array and rested it on a pedestal they created for it. Afterwards, Tao and Agatha spent the next month building a magical device to harness the powers of the space stone, while Theo helped where he could and carefully watched them work. The device would act as a permanent holder for the stone and would also let them use it for spells going forward. The only downside was they could only use it while inside the array, if they wanted to keep emissions from the stone secret. The device they created looked a lot like a sling ring, but was more of a bluish silver in color from the use of vibranium in its creation. The space stone itself wasn't visible on the device and was hidden inside it when not in use. The inside also acted as a mini sealing array to hide the stone and make it passive when inside the device. The main reason for that feature was so Tao could use the device as a normal sling ring, since it was decided that Tao would be in charge of the device because she was currently the strongest person amongst them. The argument could be made that Agatha was stronger, but the reality was Tao being younger was still more powerful than Agatha. For their next project, they created safety arrays, shields, and other protections around the main sealing array. They wanted to make sure any place they explored wouldn't be able to follow them back through any portal they made. They also made the array as the anchor point for the sling ring, so it would be easy to create a portal back in a hurry. Once finished with the device, they did some minor tests, mostly to test the power of the device and check for energy leakage from the array. When everything tested correctly and they couldn't find any type of issue, Theo finally told them the first place he wanted to go and why. "You realize this could backfire if you're not careful, correct?" Tao said. Theo nodded his head before he said, "Yes, but if it works, we could potentially gain a powerful ally. Look, I just want to go and chat with them. Worst case, it doesn't work out." Tao frowned as she said, "I've read ancient stories about her. I don't think she'll be a good ally for us. Most likely, she'll be an enemy to us if we even release her." Agatha nodded in agreement as she said, "I've seen her once, long ago, when she came to Earth with her father. She was like a bloodthirsty attack dog. Her father was the only thing that kept her in check, which is exactly why I think it could work. She needs help and I am willing to offer it. If she turns it down, we make plans to contain her." Tao let out a sigh before she said, "Fine, we'll try it out. But if things go wrong, you'll get punishment training for a month." Ezekiel shivered at the thought as he said, "I'll keep that in mind." 00114. Meeting the Goddess of Death. Time passing in this place was hard to track, and Hela found that time seemed to blur together in hell. There was no day-night/cycle here, just a pale gray light from the fog-covered sky. She did have a vague idea how much time she was imprisoned for, though. For over a millennia, Hela's view never changed and was filled with a few consistent things. A hazy gray-colored fog covered the sky, while cracked gray dirt dotted with trees, scorched black from fires, spread out around her. The immediate area around Hela was surrounded by the fallen bodies of her soldiers, while she was covered almost completely in golden chains that bound her in place. Well, former soldiers actually, the same soldiers who turned against her and helped imprison her in this god-forsaken place. She thrashed against her chains, testing the bonds once again. After an hour she stopped. They were just as strong as when they were first placed upon her. She let out a tired sigh and tried to relax inside her prison. She knew one day that her treacherous bastard of a father would die. On that day, she would be set free from this prison and would be free to claim her birthright, to be able to sit on the throne of Asgard as its rightful ruler. VVVVV. Theo created his normal clones for the night, before he made a small group of special clones for the night and hinged himself into Ezekiel. He looked at his clones as he asked, "Everyone knows the plan, correct?" Minato smiled as he said, "S-rank mission to protect 2 masters of the mystic arts and a civilian." "I'm not a civilian," Ezekiel said with a slight frown. Hashirama grinned as he said, "Compared to us, you might as well be." Tobarama, Hiruzen, Tsunade, and Tsukumo all nodded in agreement before Ezekiel said, "Whatever, go eat and get your chakra reserves up." Ezekiel went to work on his computer as his bodyguards went to eat food and fill up their chakra levels. After a couple hours, Ezekiel went to check up on them and asked, "How are you guys doing? Chakra levels adequate?" When everyone nodded in agreement, Ezekiel said, "All right, let's gear up." Ezekiel moved with his clones to a storage area filled with gear. As everyone started to gear up, Ezekiel couldn't help but smile slightly. It was the first time he was going out himself to do something somewhat dangerous. Well, it honestly wasn't that dangerous, and he had some of his strongest clones with him. He could have brought a few others, but their power set or temperament wouldn't be good for what should only be a conversation or possibly a negotiation. Otherwise, he would have brought Madara, the fourth Raikage, and a few others. Actually, when he thought about what he wanted to do, he jokingly thought about sending Naruto to see if Talk no Jutsu was real and would work. But his better judgment stopped him from doing that. After everyone was geared up, Ezekiel made a portal and teleported everyone to Genosha to meet up with Tao and Agatha. Once they arrived, Tao and Agatha turned to greet Ezekiel before Tao asked, "I'll ask one last time. Are you sure you want to try this?" "Positive." Tao let out a sigh before she handed Ezekiel a pendant as she said, "Fine. You can contact me with this when you're ready to leave." As Ezekiel placed the pendant over his neck, Tao glanced at all of Ezekiel's clones as she said, "Make sure he stays safe." Ezekiel glanced up from the pendant as he asked, "You aren't coming?" Tao shook her head as she said, "That place has nothing of interest for me or Agatha. It's basically a dead astral plane cut off from the rest of the universe." Ezekiel gave a nod and smiled as he said, "Understood. Don't plan my next vacation to the place. Just because it's a dead plane doesn't mean you should let your guard down. Always stay alert and call immediately if you need help." Ezekiel gave a proper bow as he said, "Yes, Master." "Good. I just want you to take this seriously." Tao glanced over Ezekiel and his clones as she asked, "Are you sure this will be enough clones?" "My hope is for them to not be needed. But if something does happen, they should be able to handle it." Agatha held out a small bracelet as she said, "Take this with you. It should shield you for at least 5 seconds against someone of our power." Ezekiel smiled as he placed the protective bracelet over his wrist and said, "Thank you, Master." "You're welcome." Ezekiel glanced at Tao, who nodded and opened up a silver-lined portal. His clones all moved through it first. As he was stepping through the portal himself, Tao said, "Good luck. See you in a few hours." Ezekiel was through the portal a moment later, and it snapped closed behind him. He glanced at his clones who were spread out around him and asked, "Which way?" Sakumo pointed in a certain direction as he said, "I feel something faint in that direction." All of his clones nodded in agreement as Ezekiel said, "Good. Let's go see if it's our target." A moment later, they all disappeared from view as they started to body flicker towards what Sakumo sensed. The scenery around them was mostly gray with hints of black from burn-up trees. After half an hour of traveling, they came to a stop. In front of them was the corpse of a woman, and it even looked fresh. The blood pool on the ground surrounding the woman didn't seem to be absorbed into the gray dirt yet. Ezekiel studied the woman for a few moments before he said, "She's one of the Valkyrie, but why is her body still here? Shouldn't she be just bones or something at this point?" Tsunade moved first, reaching down to check on the woman before she quickly shook her head and said, "She looks recently killed, but she's been dead a long time. Her body is ice cold to the touch and seems to be in a complete state of rigor mortis." "Ice cold? The temperature here shouldn't cool the body that much," Tobarama said before he crouched down and touched the pool of blood around the body. As he pulled up his fingers to examine it, he said, "Weird. Her blood is also really cold, but still feels fresh. Tsunade, could you double-check it?" Tsunade nodded before she used a diagnostic technique on the blood and frowned. She ran another technique over it before she said, "You're right. This blood is testing like freshly drawn blood. You could theoretically use it for a blood transfusion." As they checked the body, Minato and Sakumo scouted around the area, while Hashirama and Hiruzen stayed close to Ezekiel as guards. Minato came back from scouting first and said, "I've found signs of fighting and more bodies in the same direction we're traveling." Sakumo arrived a few minutes later and said, "I've found some signs of fighting, but no bodies." Ezekiel glanced down at Tsunade, who was still examining the body, and asked, "Find out anything else?" "No, but I want to bring the body back with us to study in the lab." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "That's fine. I was going to suggest we collect all of their bodies anyways. We can at least give them a proper burial later. Also make sure you collect any weapons you find in a different scroll, and the same thing goes for anything else you might find. I am pretty sure there should be some Pegasus around here too." Minato moved next to the body and opened up a scroll over it. After a moment, the body was pulled into the scroll and sealed away. Afterwards, they moved forward with Minato, Tobarama, Tsunade, and Sakumo running around sealing every single body and weapon they came across. After an hour or so, they came to an area with a massive amount of bodies. In the middle of the area, they could see a woman bound in golden chains who was currently looking at their group. Actually, she only seemed to be looking at Ezekiel and was ignoring everyone else with him. Ezekiel glanced at his group as he said, "Collect everything here. I'll go talk with Hela." Minato pulled out a 3-pronged kunai and handed it to Ezekiel as he said, "Just in case." Ezekiel nodded and hung the kunai from a clip on his belt before he walked towards Hela. After a few minutes, he stood about 20 feet away from the golden chains. Hela watched the clones as Ezekiel approached her, and she said, "It's been so long since I've seen another living being. You must be powerful to get past my father's sealing wards." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Not really. We kinda cheated to get here." Hela glanced at the clones once again as she asked, "We? You came with others?" Ezekiel pointed at his clones as he said, "They came with me." "It seems like they did, but they're soulless and don't count as being alive." Ezekiel wanted to argue with her, but decided against it before he said, "Fair point." Hela turned her gaze back to Ezekiel as she asked, "So who are you, and why did you come here?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "My name is Ezekiel and I came to chat with you. But depending on how things go, I might even free you." Hela's eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, "You really think you can break through my father's power and free me from these chains?" "No idea, actually, but I have some ideas on how to bypass them. But it depends on a few things," Ezekiel said with a slight shrug of his shoulders. "Name your price." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "I said it depends on a few things. The first would be on you. I know some of your history and have a decent idea of why you were locked away here by your father. But I want a better understanding of that before we go any further." Hela let out a light laugh before she said, "You want me to tell you about my life? We would be here for years if I did that." "I know. You could also lie to me about it." which is why I would rather see how you lived your life instead. The chains binding her began to shake as she struggled against them. A second later, there was a flash and Minato, along with the others, were in front of Ezekiel in a defensive stance. Ezekiel smirked slightly as Hela struggled more against her bindings, even making the ground around them shake as she tried to rip free of them. After almost 10 minutes, Hela stopped, but her face was contorted in fury as she cast a death glare at Ezekiel. Ezekiel raised his hands in a surrendering motion as he said, "Sorry. It seems I might have misspoke." "Misspoke? You misspoke?" Hela's whole body shook and the golden chains groaned slightly as she yelled out, "You question my honor. I might be a prisoner here, but I have never besmirched my honor." Ezekiel moved in front of his group and gave a formal bow as he said, "My deepest apologies, Hela Odinsdottir, rightful heir to the throne of Asgard. It was not my intention to question your honor." As Hela settled down slightly, Ezekiel stood back up straight and said, "I didn't think you would intentionally lie about your life. It's just recalling memories about your life can be fuzzy sometimes and doesn't really give you the complete picture. At least that's from my own experience as a human. I am not really sure if Asgardians share that same trait, though." Hela was quiet as Ezekiel told everyone to continue collecting everything. Once everyone left, Hela said, "Your apology is accepted, Ezekiel of Midgard." Ezekiel bowed his head and said, "Thank you. Now tell me how you plan to see my life, if you don't wish for me to tell you about it." Ezekiel smiled slightly as he said, "You would have to let me into your mind and show me your memories from there." Hela's eyes narrowed as she studied Ezekiel again. He wanted free access to her mind, which could be a dangerous thing if she wasn't careful. She had formidable defenses in place and should be fine. But was it a risk she was willing to take? As she looked at Ezekiel, she noticed something about him was off. Being the goddess of death, she had the ability to see a person's soul easily, and something about Ezekiel's soul was weird. After about a minute, Hela's eyes widened in shock as she said, "You've been touched by death before." Ezekiel smirked and nodded as he said, "Yup." Hela spent a few minutes carefully looking over Ezekiel's soul before she said, "You've been touched by death. But it wasn't any god of death from our universe, or even the aspect of death itself. Each one leaves something special behind, and it's easily recognizable. But you have nothing like that. Where exactly did you come from?" That's more of a sharing an apartment together type of question. It's definitely not a first date type of question, Ezekiel said as he smirked. Hela tilted her head slightly to the side as she asked, "You're not making sense. What are you even talking about?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Nothing important. As for your question, I've only shared that with people I completely trust." Hela studied Ezekiel some more as he glanced around and noticed that most of the area around them was already cleaned up. A few of his clones were already going farther out to search for more bodies and weapons. Only Minato and Hashirama stayed behind, but they kept a respectful distance as they quietly talked with each other. Hela finally broke her silence as she asked, "If I share my memories with you, will you answer my question?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, but I could share something important with you about your future." "You're an oracle?" Ezekiel gave another shrug as he said, "Not exactly. I don't see prophecies or anything dumb like that. I've seen the actual future, and I know what'll happen if I don't interfere in it. You allow me access to your mind, and I'll share what I know about your future." Hela thought quietly to herself as Ezekiel waited. Almost an hour passed by before Ezekiel's other clones all returned from their task. Ezekiel glanced towards them and Minato nodded at him after collecting the scrolls from the other clones. Hela also noticed the return of Ezekiel's clones and finally broke her silence as she asked, "What do you plan to do with all of them?" "Their souls should already be in Valhalla, so I was planning to give them a proper burial after my companions thoroughly examined their bodies. Something about hell affected them and made them not decay properly. We want to figure out why." Hela smiled and struggled to raise her right hand from the chains. Ezekiel's clones tensed up slightly as Ezekiel focused on the hand Hela raised. And it was a small globe the size of a baseball. She locked eyes with Ezekiel as she said, "Unfortunately, those that die in hell can't escape from it. I was able to capture their wandering souls and currently keep them contained within this 00115, A issue from hell." Ezekiel watched the orb for a little while before he asked, I would like to trade for that sphere of souls if possible. Hela lowered her hand, which disappeared underneath the golden chains surrounding her body. She glanced around at the puddles of blood as she asked, Tell me where you came from, and you can have it. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I can't do that currently, but let me think it over for a while, and I might change my mind. Ezekiel glanced back at his clones for a moment before he said, We are pretty much done here for now, and I know sharing your mind with someone else is a major concern, so I'll give you some time to think it over. Ezekiel glanced at Minato as he said, Bring that scroll over and unseal what we brought. Minato walked over as he pulled a scroll out and stopped next to Ezekiel. He held the scroll out and pushed a bit of chakra into it. In front of them appeared what looked like a large box. The front of it was mostly just a large LCD display, with a large speaker bar set up underneath it. Ezekiel walked around to the front of it, which faced Hela, as he said, As a sign of goodwill, I had this made for you. Hela glanced at the black, colored box for a moment before she asked, And what purpose does this box fulfill? Entertainment. Modern Earth entertainment, to be exact. Ezekiel said with a smile. Ezekiel patted the side of the device as he said, I figured it might be boring her all alone, so I built this with the help of some friends. Power on. The front of the device powered on to show a menu with some options. Books, movies, comics, TV shows, and games was the current list displayed on the screen. Ezekiel smiled as he said, This works through voice control and has pretty much everything you could possibly want to watch or read from Earth. You can also play some basic games with it. Midgardian entertainment, I doubt it will be worthy of my time. Hela scoffed as she looked away from the device. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, There's also history books, movies, and documentaries to watch. But it's up to you if you want to use it. I would personally recommend watching the Star Wars movie series or Indiana Jones myself. Hela glanced at Ezekiel and then the device for a few moments before she said, Fine, I'll accept your tribute. Ezekiel smiled as he said, Great. We'll leave you alone for now, and I'll be back in a month or so to visit. Hela fought back the urge to command him to stay. It had been so long since she had a conversation with another living being. She missed it. But even if she did try to command him, it wasn't like he needed to listen to her. As long as she was trapped in these chains, she was weak and powerless to do anything. Ezekiel pushed some universal energy into the return tracker, and a few moments later a portal opened up next to him. Tao and Agatha peeked through the portal, and once they saw Ezekiel, they looked relieved before they moved away from the portal entrance. Ezekiel's clones moved through the portal first, while Ezekiel waved before he stepped through the portal. It snapped closed after him, and Hela let out a frustrated sigh. Now she was alone again. Would he keep his promise and come back? Hela let out another sigh before she looked at the large device in front of her for a few minutes. He said it contained Midgardian entertainment, but would any of it be good? The last time she visited the place, they still lived in stone huts. What possible entertainment could they have made since then? Device, play the Star Wars movie series. As the intro for A New Hope played and Hela saw the title, she said, Stop. After the movie stopped, she said, Play from the first movie in the series. Again, A New Hope started up, so Hela said, Stop and show Star Wars movie list. Once she saw that A New Hope was the first movie, she said out loud, Who names the first movie episode 4? VVVVV. Tao smiled slightly as she asked, I assume your first contact went well? Kinda. But we ran into an issue I didn't plan for. We recovered decently intact bodies of the Valkyries, and Hela has a sphere filled with their souls. Tao frowned slightly as she asked, You want to revive them? We could always use a powerful group of honor-bound warriors. Agatha shook her head as she said, They would be bound to continue their duty for Asgard. Ezekiel had a wicked grin as he said, Not if we tell them the truth of what happened. That they were sacrificed by Odin for no good reason, and he knew none of them would ever make it to Valhalla if they died in hell. He also covered up what happened to them and pretty much erased them from Asgardian history. Tao cast a quick glance at Agatha for a moment before she asked, How sure are you about that? About 70%, give or take. If we could sneak into the library of Asgard, we could find out exactly what happened. Let's go back to your training room. You need to start your training for the day, and we need some time to think about this. Tao said, before she moved to exit the room. Once they made it back to the training room, everyone split off to do their own thing. Theo started training. His clones went off to the other bases to work on projects, while Tao and Agatha started to discuss the possibility of sneaking into Asgard. Their discussion didn't go that well and ended up stalling out. The main issue was how they wouldn't be caught, since Asgard should have magic defenses in place. If they portaled anywhere into Asgard, then they should easily be caught. At least that was their assumption. They were also debating if they should bring the issue up to the council so they could vote on it. Theo, who was seated close by practicing his casting speed, finally spoke up after about an hour and said, "Well, first of all, this is a side project, so I don't think we need to involve the council for now. It will only matter if we get the info we are seeking and can get that soul sphere. You think trying to break into Asgard for information and potentially resurrecting 1,000 skilled warriors is a side project?" Agatha asked with a single raised eyebrow. Theo shrugged as he said, "I am also trying to recruit a powerful woman who could be considered a god as a side project, so I don't really see your point." Tao nodded as she said, "I agree that the council doesn't need to be aware of what we are currently doing. If we fail, then it won't matter anyways. But if we succeed, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it." Theo nodded as he said, "Exactly. Now as for how we get into Asgard, I say we don't go and just cheat instead. We have the time stone after all, let's use it." "I was thinking of doing that, but we really shouldn't rely on it so heavily. It will make us weaker if we do," Tao said. Agatha let out a light chuckle before she said, "Says the woman who used the time stone to help guide their actions for the last 800 years. Theo nodded as he said, "Yeah, you're kinda being a hypocrite. I'm speaking from experience. I might be powerful, but if I didn't rely so heavily on the time stone, I could have improved even more and touched on Yao's level of power by now," Tao said in a regretful tone, with a slight frown as she crossed her arms over her chest. Theo's concentration broke on the spell formula he was building, which caused it to shatter in front of him as he glanced at Tao and asked, "Didn't you plan on dying, though?" "That was the plan, since I couldn't see past my own death. But things have changed, and now I have some regrets about my past actions." "You sound a little upset. Does your favorite student need to give you a hug, Master?" Ezekiel asked as he smiled. Tao returned a flat look as she said, "You lost concentration on your last spell. Start over from the beginning." Theo let out a sigh as he started his practice over and said, "How about we send in a couple of my clones to scout Asgard? No gear, just my clone. If they get caught, they dispel and leave no trace behind." Tao glanced at a couple of Theo's clones who were currently reading books and asked, "Have you learned Asgardian runes yet? You would need that to understand the basics of their language." Theo nodded as he said, "I've already read everything you have about Asgard. I also supplemented my knowledge with history books and learned the language basics of most cultures that believed in Norse mythology." Theo smiled slightly as he said, "I wanted to be ready when Thor arrived." "Good. Then we'll use a couple of your clones to scout their library and find out their history. If it doesn't work out, we'll use the time stone to figure out a different way to gain the information." They talked for another hour, before Tao took Minato, Tobarama, Sakumo, and Hiruzen with her back to Genosha. They also left all their gear behind and hinged into different-looking people before they left. VVVVV. Tao glanced at the clones as she said, "This portal will appear far outside of the city of Asgard. If you aren't caught and have some things to bring back, one of you dispel to let Theo know, and I will make a return portal for you to use in the same place." Each clone nodded in understanding before Tao opened a portal, and the clones disappeared through it before it snapped closed. It all took place within a few seconds. Hopefully Asgard didn't have magic wards in the outskirts of its land. On the other side of the portal, Minato glanced at his companions and said, "From what we know, the main library of Asgard should be in the palace. I think we should scout the city first and collect any information we can before we move into the palace." The others nodded in agreement before Sakumo asked, "Should we split up completely or split into teams?" "We should move alone. We'll have a higher chance to gain information, and it will give us 4 chances to enter the palace. We should also enter the city from different locations. I will take the north," Tobarama said as he glanced at the others. Minato nodded as he said, "I'll take the opposite side since I'm the fastest." I'll take the southern side then, Hiruzen said. That leaves me on this side then. They shared a silent nod with each other before they disappeared from their spots and moved towards the Golden City in the distance. Each person going towards the side they picked and prepared to put their skills to the test against people who considered themselves gods. 00116. Spying on Asgard. Heimdall's gaze focused in on an area near the edge of Asgard's landmass. He thought he heard voices from that area, which was rarely used. But after he scanned the whole area and the surrounding land closer to the city, he found no one. Nor did he find footprints or any type of disturbance in the area. Heimdall frowned slightly as he opened his eyes. He was positive he heard someone speaking. Midgardian? Heimdall closed his eyes again and focused completely on Asgard and its surrounding land. He wanted to make sure no one had come unannounced to the kingdom he swore to protect. Minato, unaware someone powerful was looking for him and the others, arrived at the outer wall of the city and carefully checked around the area. After half an hour, and not finding anything that looked like security, Minato quickly scaled the wall and reached the other side. He was greeted with a single building, next to an open space that looked like it was used for training. The first thing he did was head towards a small building off to the side and snuck inside it. Inside he found a large stash of training weapons and not much else. So he quickly left the area and moved towards the city itself. Minato decided to take it slowly and hid in a few areas with a lot of traffic. His goal was to eavesdrop on as many people as possible and hopefully find out some useful information. Minato took his time as he spied on the people of Asgard, and he ended up disappointed. It was like spying on normal civilians. There were no real secrets to find here, just gossip. Still, Minato snuck around the city as he waited for night to fall over Asgard. He planned to make a move on the palace and the library when the least amount of people would be wandering around. Since he had time to waste, Minato went around and memorized the layout of the city, since it would be useful in the future. Time passed by as Minato moved throughout the city undetected. He even shadowed a few guard patrols and found where the different guard stations were throughout the city. Useful information if Asgard ever became their enemy. Overall, Minato was disappointed in what he found in the city. The security was lacking everywhere, and the guards didn't seem to be doing a proper job. Their patrols were lax, and they barely looked around as they casually talked with each other, while the gate guards seemed to be more for decoration than anything else. Honestly, the whole place was a joke to him. He expected more from one of the most feared kingdoms in the universe. But instead, they acted like no one would dare to attack them, as if their reputation would ward off attackers. Minato shook his head at how laughable it was. Konohagakure was considered the strongest village in his world, and that never stopped people from attacking it. If anything, it encouraged people to attack it. Minato was also confused over why they didn't integrate technology into their gear. He found their lack of technology after he snuck into a guard station and went through their weapon and supply racks, which weren't locked or secured in any way at all. They were just out in the open for anyone to grab. He knew Asgard was an advanced race and could travel the universe with ease, but not integrating technology into everything seemed stupid to him. Sure, they had very complex and advanced magic, which was integrated into what they used as far as he could tell. But why not add technology into the mix as well? It was something Tobirama and others were currently working on to help improve the equipment they already used. Even a few of the prototype weapons that were being worked on were more powerful than the spears the guards seemed to carry around. Minato shook his head to clear it. He didn't need to worry about Asgard and its seemingly abysmal defenses, or its complete lack of using technology for its own benefit. He would let Theo know about it, and from there it was Theo's problem to deal with. Once night finally fell over the city, the golden glow of the sun was replaced with what looked like the glow from magical lights and the heat from wood-fueled fires. Minato hung out around the city for a while, longer before he finally moved towards the palace. The Golden Palace was easily the biggest building Minato had ever seen. He might have seen some that were taller, but for overall size, this one easily took first place, plus it seemed to be made completely out of gold. While very impressive to look at, it seemed dumb if Minato was being honest. Gold might be valuable, but it was one of the softest metals out there. How was it meant to protect against attacks? As Minato approached a side entrance to the palace, which he found earlier in the day, he double-checked the area before he slipped past the guards on duty, who seemed to be playing some type of card game and never even bothered to look around once as he moved past them. Inside, he was greeted by massive halls lined with intricate columns and shadowy alcoves. He couldn't ask for a better place to move undetected if he tried. During the day, it might have been more well-lit. But at night, only the middle of the hallway received direct lighting from magical lights hanging from the middle of the ceiling. Minato slowly made his way through the hallways, checking every room he passed by. Most of them seemed to be guest rooms, which might explain the overly lax security in the area. The few non-guest rooms he found were either for guards or used as storage. He checked a few of them completely, but when he found nothing important, he decided to stop and focused on making it to the library instead. It took him about an hour to check all the rooms in that area before he came to another guard station. This time the guards were paying attention to the surrounding area, but were also holding a conversation about what they would do after their shift ended, which turned out to be drinking at a mead hall in town. Minato shook his head as he snuck past the guards using the shadows. He moved deeper into the palace this time and was extra careful as he checked rooms, since he ran into a few patrolling guards in this new area within a few minutes of arriving. This wing of the palace seemed to be the living quarters for some of the court officials. Apparently there was more than just a king in this Asgard. Minato didn't stay in the area long and moved into another area of the palace with less active guards. The new wing seemed to be what he was looking for, since it only had a few sets of double doors. The first set of doors he opened up to explore turned out to be a massive meeting chamber. It was currently empty and dimly lit. In the middle of the room was a large table, currently cleaned up and ready for use. Minato found a couple sets of doors that led elsewhere out of the room and checked each of those carefully. Each one opened up to different areas of the palace. One of them was a kitchen area, while the other seemed to be for the royal family as it was jam-packed with guard patrols. Minato cautiously headed back out to the other hallway and decided to explore the other areas later. After checking a couple other rooms, he came to what he assumed was the library. The room was filled with bookshelves and was slightly better lit than the hallways. But the large vaulted ceilings, columns, and tall bookshelves gave him plenty of places to hide in the shadows. Before he started to look for information, he moved to double-check the library. He wanted to see if the other clones made it, and to make sure the place was empty of other people. From the top of the bookshelves, Minato slowly made his way through the library. He scanned row after row of books, taking note of where things were, while also making sure no one else was there. He easily noticed Tobirama, Hiruzen, and Tsukumo after a few moments as he moved near the center of the room. They were gathered near the center of the library and seemed to be watching someone. Minato moved closer, and just as he reached the same area, he stopped moving. Something felt off to him. He double-checked his surroundings, but couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. He glanced back over at the person seated on the far side of a table from the bookshelves he was hiding on and took a closer look at them. It was a beautiful woman, with healthy, lightly tanned skin. Her dirty blonde hair was tied up in an intricate bun-type pattern, which ended in a braid over her left shoulder that framed her gorgeous face, while her bright blue eyes were currently focused on a book in front of her. As Minato watched the woman, she said, "Come out, I know you're there." All of the clones froze in place and didn't move as the woman looked up from her book in Minato's direction. The woman stared in his direction for a few more moments before a man seemed to appear out of thin air. He was a tall, pale-skinned man with raven black hair. He wore a fancy green outfit with highlights of gold. He smiled at the woman and said, "It seems my skills still need work. I still can't hide from you properly, mother." The woman smiled brightly as she said, "Your skills are exceptional, Loki, but a son can never truly hide from their mother's gaze." Loki nodded slightly as he said, "You did train me after all, so I guess you'd always be able to find me." "That's also true. So why did you come to find me? Do you want to study with me?" Loki shook his head and said, "I came to get you. It's almost dinner time." Frigga smiled again as she said, "Such a caring child. What did I do to have such a lovely boy as you?" Loki didn't reply as Frigga stood up from her chair and moved towards him. When she reached him, she extended her elbow for his arm. After he slipped his arm around her elbow, she said, "Please, lead the way." After a few minutes, the only people in the room were the clones. Minato moved next to the other clones and said, "That was close." Tobirama nodded as he said, "I honestly thought she found you for a moment, The others nodded in agreement before Sakumo said, "How about I watch over the door while the rest of you search, in case she comes back after dinner?" The others agreed and Sakumo moved to watch the door as the others moved to search through the library. Luckily, no one else came back into the library for the night, and they were easily able to find all the information they needed. It did take them most of the night, though. While they had a decent idea on how to read the Asgardian language, it took a while. Once they completed their task, they split up again and moved out of the palace. Since they weren't exploring the place and it was still dark outside, it only took them 20 minutes to make it back to their extraction point. Once there, Sakumo dispelled himself so Theo could let Tao know they needed a pickup. They all could have dispelled to save time, but this way they would be able to copy the information down once they were back at Theo's base. After about 20 minutes, a portal opened up and all of the clones moved through it before it snapped closed behind them. Once back at Theo's personal base, Minato, Tobirama, and Hiruzen worked for hours to copy down all the information they found. Besides history, they also collected other information like the location of planets, powerful factions in the universe, and anything else that seemed slightly important. Overall, it was a decent amount of intelligence they collected. Now Theo would have to work on the next step, cloning a new body for the leader of the Valkyries, and seeing if she would want to join his faction with her army. VVVVV. Heimdall spent a full day and night with his senses completely focused on Asgard and found nothing. But he still sent a report in to have guards check out the area he heard the voices at the night before. Within an hour, a squad used for tracking was in the area and searched the whole place, but they also found nothing. Heimdall couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there last night, but with nothing to go on, he had to let the matter drop. 00117. Something more important than a soul sphere. A few weeks passed by as Theo's clones worked on making a clone of the Valkyrie's leader. How did they know which body was from the leader? The armor had small decorations for the person's rank. They used the information they gathered from Asgard to cross-check with and figured out what rank was what. Once they found the leader, Tobirama and Orochimaru started working on making a clone. That is where they were now, with a body almost fully formed. Now Theo needed to figure out a way to get their souls from Hela. He could only really offer her two things, her freedom and what might happen to her in the future. But he already offered that if she let him in her mind, maybe he could offer her the chance at freedom. Theo shook his head to clear it. He would have to discuss the idea with Tao and Agatha. Maybe they could think of something else that would be worth trading for. But that could wait for now. Theo needed to focus on his current task. Theo double-checked the little booklet in front of himself. It was one of his birthday presents he was finally going to use. It was a booklet that detailed how to make a go-kart from scratch. His mom wasn't a big fan of the idea, but Jacob was able to talk her into letting Theo make one. Well, it would be Theo and Peter making go-karts. Luckily, Millie ended up not being interested in the idea of making her own go-kart, which might have been why Daniel agreed to the idea in the first place. Theo looked over what was required to make a go-kart one more time before he placed the booklet down and glanced over to Peter as he asked, "Are you ready to go find stuff?" "Yup. Uncle Ben even said he would help and pay for anything we're able to pull out from the scrapyard." Theo smiled as he said, "Awesome. Let's bring some tools so we can break things down easily." Peter nodded his head, and they walked over to the community toolbox. While everyone who worked in the shop had their own tools, there was also the community toolbox anyone could use. It was mostly filled with extra tools that were collected over the years. You could find pretty much anything you would need inside it. The only issue was the tools weren't in the best shape, and they weren't arranged in any type of order. So you would have to dig around for a while to find what you were looking for. Theo and Peter spent half an hour collecting tools they thought they would need. Some hammers, a hacksaw, crescent wrenches, a couple screwdrivers along with a few other things. They loaded all of the tools into a wagon and pulled it over to Ben, who was talking with Jacob. Both men smiled at the boys as Jacob asked, "You ready to check out the scrapyard?" "Yeah. Hopefully we can find everything to make 2 carts." Jacob rubbed the top of Theo's head as he said, "Don't worry. If Alexei's scrapyard doesn't have it, you don't need it." Ben finished with a laugh. Ben picked up the tools in the little red wagon the boys used and placed it in an extra-large custom-made wagon. It was something he made with Jacob. It was designed to be pushed and pulled around the shop. But if the load was too heavy to move, it had a small lawn-mower engine that could help move it around. They mostly used it to transport stuff to and from the scrapyard. while they normally like to fabricate or use new parts in their projects. A lot of older cars could only be fixed with used parts. They would make sure to get the best condition parts possible, but they were still used. Ben double-checked everything in the wagon before he took the handle and said, "All right, let's go. We'll take care of the heavy lifting for you boys." Theo looked up at his dad as he asked, "You're coming too?" "Yup. I need to talk with Alexei and don't want to miss your first trip to the scrapyard." Ben and Jacob led the boys out of the warehouse and down the road a couple of blocks to a large open gate. A large dump truck drove through the gate as they approached, and Theo couldn't help but notice it looked filled to the brim with junk. Metal pipes, wire, a fridge door, tires, and wood were the handful of things he saw sticking out of the bin before it drove out of sight. Ben paused at the gate for a few moments, making sure another vehicle wasn't coming, before he pulled the wagon into the scrapyard. As Theo walked past the gate, he was impressed by what he saw. From what he could see, the scrapyard seemed to be organized. At least the large piles of tires, metal, wood, and other stuff made it seem like it was. They moved away from the main area where dump trucks were dumping their loads and went towards a trailer off to the right side of the gate. On top of the trailer was a sign that read, "Alexei Scrapyard. If we don't have it, you don't need it." As they walked up to the trailer, the larger-than-average door swung open and a giant of a man stepped outside as he asked in a heavy Russian accent, "My friends, what brings you to my humble scrapyard today?" Jacob placed his hand on Theo and Peter's shoulder as he walked the boys forward and said, "The boys are going to make go-karts and need some parts to do it. I figured this would be the best place to find what they need." The man smiled widely as he walked in front of Jacob as he said, "Of course. If they can't find it here, then they don't need it." Ben and Jacob finished with a laugh. Alexei nodded before he knelt down next to the boys and said, "You must be Peter and Theo. 'Tis nice to finally meet you both." Before he stretched out his large hand and engulfed the boys' hands as he shook each one, Alexei smiled at the boys as he said, "I've heard so much about you. I almost feel like you're my nephews. You call me Uncle Alexei from now on, da?" Peter said, "Yes, Uncle Alexei." As Theo nodded and asked, "Does that mean we get a family discount, Uncle Alexei?" Alexei's laugh was loud and came from deep in his chest before he said, "Just as quick-witted as your father said." Alexei patted Theo's head as he stood back up and said, "Of course I'll give you a discount, little Theo. You get same discount as your father." "Thanks, Uncle Alexei. You're the best." Alexei laughed again before he said, "Come into my office. I'll get you set up to explore the scrapyard." Within 10 minutes, they were back outside the office with bright yellow vests and hard hats. Well, Theo and Peter's hats were oversized for them, but they made it work with some extra padding. The vests were also oversized for the boys and just looked comical on them, as they almost touched the ground. Theo was pretty sure his dad picked the largest vests there, so he could take pictures of them like that. From there, they moved into the scrapyard and started to look for parts to build their go-karts. The first stop was the mountain of tires, since it was the closest to the gate and Alexei's trailer. It was luckily sorted into different groups of tires, and they quickly found some used wheelbarrow tires. They weren't the best thing they could use, but the size was decent enough and they were in good shape. From there, they moved towards an area of scrap metal. It was mostly filled with pipes, tubes, and plates of metal. They were even separated into different types of metal, the most common type being plain steel. Stainless steel was the second largest pile, followed by aluminum and copper. As they moved into the area, Jacob looked around as he asked, "Do you know what you want to build the cart's body out of?" The booklet said steel tubing or pipe is best for strength, while aluminum is better for weight. But it also said something about the thickness of the metal needing to be a certain size, or the cart could easily bend or break. Jacob smiled as he patted Theo's head and said, "The wall thickness of the metal. The thicker it is, the stronger the metal can be." Peter looked at all the metal pipe and tubing before he pointed out a solid piece of steel and said, "Then shouldn't we use that stuff? It's completely solid. That should be good, right?" Ben shook his head as he said, "You would think that, but let me show you something cool." Ben walked over and after a few minutes pulled out 2 pieces of metal. Both were about the same size and thickness, except one was a solid rod and the other was a tube. He brought them over to the group and placed them down before he said, "Try to pick each of those up, one at a time." Both Peter and Theo were barely able to lift up the rod, but easily picked up the tube. Once they finished, Peter excitedly said, "The solid one is bad 'cause it weighs too much." Ben smiled as he picked up the rod and said, "That's one reason. But there is another more important reason. We don't want to use the rod for the carts." Ben wedged the rod deep into a pipe covered by a bunch of other stuff and began to lift up on it. It took a few seconds, but the rod started to bend. After the rod had a decent bend, Ben pulled it out and showed it to Peter as he asked, "You see how easy that was?" Peter nodded as Ben took the tube and tried to repeat the process with it. After about a minute, Ben said, "Jacob, help me out with this real quick." Jacob moved close and tried to help Ben to bend the tube, but nothing happened. Once they finished, Ben pulled the tube out and showed it to Peter. There was a tiny bend in the tube, but not much else. Peter glanced between the tube and the rod a few times before he asked, "The tube is stronger?" "Yup." Peter looked at the tube again as he said, "But it's hollow. Shouldn't it be weaker?" Ben tossed the tube and rod back into the scrap pile before he said, "You know what else is hollow and really strong?" Peter shook his head before Ben said, "Your bones." Peter lifted his arm and looked at it as he asked, "My bones are hollow?" Ben smiled as he said, "Yup, everyone's bones are hollow. It makes them stronger and lighter at the same time." Peter looked at his arm and then some of the tubes before he asked, "So we need to make the go-karts out of tubes, so it's as strong as our bones? What about the square tubing? Will that be strong also?" Ben shook his head as he said, "Yes and no. It'll be lighter and stronger than the solid rods of steel, but not stronger than a piece of pipe or tubing of the same size, depending on how you use it." Peter looked up at Ben as he asked, "Why? What makes it different?" Jacob rubbed the top of Peter's head as he said, "You would have to ask your dad that, since he is smarter than both me and Ben. He better be smarter than both of us. He's the one who went to college after all." Ben said. Jacob nodded in agreement before he said, "Yup. Now, how about we find some decent tubing we can use to make your go-kart frames?" They spent the next hour digging through the piles of metal looking for tubing that was relatively the same size and thickness. Once they had what they thought was enough, they moved to another area to look for more parts. They found some passable seats to use from a couple busted-up riding mowers. They also scavenged the pedals and steering wheels from them. Next, they found some metal cable that could be used for the throttle cable to the engines, along with some sprockets and chains to use for the cart's drive chain, besides some other basic odds and ends. The last piece they looked for were the engines. There was an area of the scrapyard that had tons of different engines. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, boats, lawnmowers. Anything that used an engine could be found in this area. Mostly it was just the engine portion of the device or vehicle. But there were still a couple vehicles mostly intact, waiting for the engine to be removed. As they were looking around, Jacob spotted some junk pressure washers and moved over to check them out, while Ben spotted some broken generators. Theo and Peter were also looking around at stuff, but mostly stuck close to Ben and Jacob. Jacob wrestled one of the pressure washers out and looked it over before he said, "This should work for one of the engines. It's 9 horsepower and has a 3/4-inch shaft. It also seems to be in good shape." Ben came over to check it out and nodded once he finished looking it over. He glanced at the other pressure washer as he asked, "That one looks to be the same. We should grab that for spare parts. Worst case, we can make one working engine out of both of them." Jacob nodded, and they hauled the 2 pressure washers to the cart and tossed them inside it. Then they went back to looking for another engine. It didn't take long before they found a couple more engines with the same specs. After they were loaded into the cart, they made their way back to Alexei's office. Once they paid, they headed back to the shop to start the process of mocking up the go-karts. The plan was to lay everything out and double-check if they were missing anything. Then they would help the boys start with the engine teardowns. Once the engines were rebuilt and working, they would move on to building the cart's frame from there. As Theo was helping his dad unbolt the engine from the pressure washer's frame, any background thoughts he had lingering in his mind faded away. He became lost in the moment and just soaked up everything his father was explaining to him. It was moments like these that made Theo happy he came to this world. Not to be a hero, but because of the loving family he had. 00118. Making a friend? Maybe. A portal opened up in Tony's workshop and Ezekiel walked out of it. In his hands, he carried a couple of bags, which he placed on a table. He looked around the room and, not finding Tony, picked up the bags and headed upstairs. As he moved upstairs, he could hear Tony arguing with someone. "I already told you, the project doesn't interest me." Someone let out an exhausted sigh before they said, "It might not interest you, but the company is under contract. You know, the same company you own, the one with your last name on it. It's just a single development contract. We've failed to deliver on them before. I doubt another failure will be an issue." Ezekiel made it to the top of the stairs and saw a tall, bald-headed white man in a suit as he said, "We at least delivered failures or half-working prototypes. We currently have nothing to deliver for this contract." Tony rubbed the bridge of his nose as he said, "We have a whole team of overpaid researchers on payroll. Have them make something. What do you think I've been doing for the last 9 months? While you've been working on some secret project, which you still won't even tell me about." The man said as he sat down on the couch with a huff, "I already told you. I signed an NDA till the project is ready for stage 1. Once we are finished with this round of tests, I should be able to talk about some of the project with you." Ezekiel walked out of the stairwell and towards the living room as he said, "That'll be in 3 months or so, if the simulated load tests finish running with positive results." The man turned around as Tony said, "Just in time like always. I was getting hungry." "Obi, this is Ezekiel." "Ezekiel, this is Obi." Obadiah seemed a little on guard as he stood up from the couch and said, "Forgive me, I didn't realize Tony was expecting any guests. I'm Obadiah Stain." Obadiah reached out a hand to Ezekiel after he set the bags down on the table. As they shook hands, Ezekiel said, "You're fine. Tony wasn't expecting me. I just show up whenever I'm in the area. People call me Ezekiel. I'm a professional delivery boy." After they shook hands, Stain said, "You have to be more than a delivery boy. I saw your performance on TV with Tony." Ezekiel smiled as he moved towards Tony and handed him a USB before he said, "You're right, but 90% of my interactions with Tony are strictly delivery-based." Ezekiel turned to Tony as he said, "That's all the current data we've collected. Check it over and see if there's any issues." Tony slid the USB into his pocket as he said, "I'll check it over later. What did you bring for dinner?" Ezekiel pointed to the bags and said, "Just some burgers and fries. I also brought a keto-friendly lettuce-wrapped burger for Happy." Ezekiel glanced at Obadiah as he said, "I always bring extra, so if you're hungry, feel free to dig in." Obadiah glanced at Tony pulling out food as he said, "Thank you, but I ate before I arrived." Tony unwrapped a burger as he said, "More for me and Ezekiel then." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Unfortunately, I can't hang out today. I mostly came by to bring you that data." "What? Why not? What's so important you can't hang out for a while?" Tony asked. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I have some negotiations to hold with a secretly exiled princess for an item in her possession." Tony perked up as he asked, "Secretly exiled princess? Is she hot? And if she is, mind if I tag along?" Obadiah rubbed his temple as he said, "Tony, please don't give us any more bad press." Ezekiel just smirked before he said, "As far as looks go, she's good enough to be a model, and while normally I might say no to inviting you along, she's basically a homicidal maniac with daddy issues, so you guys might actually get along and hit it off." Tony started to laugh, and even Obadiah joined him, thinking it was a joke. When Ezekiel didn't join them, Tony stopped laughing and asked, "Wait, you're being serious? I met her about a month ago and she was surrounded by dead bodies at the time. So? Yeah." Tony put down his burger as he asked, "Dude, what the fuck is wrong with her and why isn't she in jail? Also, what does the crazy bitch have that you need to trade for anyways? Can't you just take it from her?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I already told you. She's a homicidal maniac with daddy issues, and she's currently imprisoned. It's part of the reason she is living in exile. They couldn't lock her up in her native lands." Ezekiel then glanced from Obadiah to Tony as he said, "As for the item in question, let's just say it's worth a small army. Plus, I would rather make friends with her than have a new potential enemy." Tony shook his head as he said, "I'm good. I'll just stay home and check over the data you gave me." Ezekiel shrugged as he started to walk out of the living room and said, "Suit yourself. I'll be back in a week or so." Ezekiel nodded to Obadiah as he said, "It was nice to meet you, Mr. Stain. Till next time." "Same to you," Obadiah said. After Ezekiel left, Obadiah glanced at Tony as he asked, "He's the reason you're working on that secret project?" Tony nodded as Obadiah asked, "Who exactly is that and how did you meet him?" Tony shrugged as he said, "I'm not really allowed to talk about it, but you're free to look into him if you want." I did, and all it gave me was more questions. Obadiah raised an eye as he looked at Tony and asked, "What's really going on, Tony? First you say you can't talk about some secret project. Now you can't tell me about the person you were working with. Normally you can't wait to brag about stuff like this, and I know it's not because of the NDA you signed. So what's the issue?" Tony shook his head as he said, "I really can't talk about it." Then he mumbled to himself, "He'll ban me from Vibe if I say anything," before he took another bite of his burger. A moment later, Happy ran into the room with his gun out before he saw Obadiah and Tony. Then he saw the bags of food on the table and said, "He did it again." VVVVV. A portal opened in hell close to Hela as she was watching a World War II movie. As Ezekiel stepped out of the portal, Hela said, "Pause." The portal closed as the movie paused and Hela turned to look at her new guest. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I'm happy to see you putting that to use." Hela nodded as she said, "I admit, it's made staying here a little less boring. Glad I could help." Hela nodded again and said, "If you've come for an answer, I still haven't made up my mind." "That's fine. I actually wanted to see if I could trade your possible future for that soul sphere." Hela shook her head as she said, "I don't think that's a very fair trade." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "You're right. I would be trading at a loss." Hela raised an eyebrow as she asked, "What makes you think that? You said it yourself. You can't guarantee that what you share with me will happen or not." "That's very true, but I can share more than one future with you. How about I show you the 10 most likely to happen? Then you can plan against them." Hela's eyes narrowed slightly as she said, "You want me to believe you've seen my future enough that you know the 10 most likely ways I'll die?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I have no reason to lie to you. You also have no reason to tell the truth." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You're wrong about that. I am trying to befriend you. Lying would be counterintuitive to that process." Hela's eyes were almost slits as she asked, "And why are you trying to befriend me? Do I really need a reason to make a new friend?" Ezekiel asked, "Of course. Everyone makes friends with people who are useful. If they're not useful, why would you need to be friends?" Hela asked. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he asked, "Fine. It's because you're strong and you won't always be locked away? Happy?" Hela shook her head as she said, "That's a good reason, but it's not yours. Now tell me why you want to be friends." "You won't like it," Ezekiel said. Hela frowned as she asked, "Because you're just like everyone else? You have a use for me, and once that's been filled, you'll pretend I no longer exist?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No. The opposite, actually. I've seen many different versions of your life, and they were all about the same. But the one thing I noticed through every single one was you never had a true friend. Someone who wanted to be friends, just to be friends. You kind of make that hard for people to do in the first place, so I can see why it hasn't happened before, though." Ezekiel pointed to himself as he said, "But I am willing to put in the work if you are. Not because you're powerful, or who your family might be, or anything else for that matter. I would like to be your friend, just to be your friend." Hela's eyes were still narrowed as she asked, "What about the deals you were trying to make with me?" "Those are straightforward trades, where both parties gain something they want. Nothing more or less, and if they don't go, though, I won't hold it against you." Hela laughed before the chains started to shake and her arm moved out of them, holding the soul sphere. She locked eyes with Ezekiel as she said, "Take it." "But I said take it." Hela's arm shook as she held it out of the chains. Ezekiel moved close, reached out, and took the soul sphere in his hand. It was warm to the touch and vibrated slightly once it was fully in his hand. Hela's hand disappeared back into the chains as Ezekiel looked her in the face and asked, "Why?" "Because I felt like it. Now leave. I want to be left alone," Hela said. Ezekiel glanced at the soul sphere for a few moments before he smiled and said, "Thanks." Ezekiel pulled a flash drive out of his pocket and moved next to the device he left last time and plugged it into the device as he said, "If you want to see what might happen to you, just tell the device you want to see the future." As Hela glanced at the device, Ezekiel rubbed his bracelet and pushed some power into it. A second later, a portal opened up, and he stepped through it before it snapped closed behind him. Hela let out a sigh before she said, "Resume play?" VVVVV. A few hours later, Tao, Agatha, Ezekiel, and a few of his clones were in the medical base with the clone body of the Valkyrie's leader. Tao was holding a device that held the soul sphere and was focusing on the soul sphere itself. After a while, a wisp of light came out of the soul sphere and was pushed into the body. After a few moments, the Valkyrie leader shot up on the bed holding her chest as she sucked in a ragged breath. Within moments, she rolled off the bed and took up a defensive stance as she glanced at everyone in the room. Ezekiel raised both his arms up and said, "Lady Sanhilder, we mean you no harm." Sanhilder narrowed her eyes as she asked, "Who are you? Why am I here?" "I'm Ezekiel, and you're here because you died." 00119. Sometimes your word isn't enough. Sanhilder glanced at the people in the room with her while looking for a suitable weapon. When she didn't find anything and the other people didn't move, she said, "I know I died. I felt Hela's blade pierce my heart, but I should be in Valhalla with my sisters." Her eyes narrowed as she asked in a lower tone of voice, "Instead, I seem to be still alive? Where am I and why have you brought me here?" Ezekiel, with his hands still raised, said, "We mean you no harm. You are currently on Midgard. As for why you are here, we brought you back to life." Sanhilder glanced at everyone once more, her eyes lingering on Tao and Agatha before she asked, "For what purpose did you do this, Midgardian?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "To help you and your sisters mostly. But I'll be honest that the idea of having some powerful warriors owe you a favor or two doesn't hurt." Sanhilder focused her gaze on Ezekiel as she asked, "What makes you think we need your help in the first place?" Ezekiel lowered his hands before he pointed at the soul sphere Tao currently possessed and said, "Well, considering all your sister's souls besides Brunhilde's are locked in that thing to start." Sanhilder's eyes widened slightly at Brunhilde's name before it sharpened in on the soul sphere as she asked, "Is that why I am not in Valhalla? Was I trapped in that thing, along with my sisters?" There was a slight pause before her voice took an edge and she asked, "Was it Hela's doing?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "While Hela might have saved your souls in that sphere, it's actually Odin's fault. Watch how you speak of my liege, mortal. Wow, you still consider him your liege. You know you died for him once already. Your duty should be considered over by now." Sanhilder stood up straight, but kept up her guard as she said, "My duty to the king and the people of Asgard is my life's work. Now that I am alive again, I can go back and protect them." Ezekiel let out a tired sigh before he said, "So you would go back into service for a king who pretty much erased your existence, to a place that has no idea why you and the other Valkyries died? A place that doesn't even sing of your glorious last battle?" Ezekiel stared directly into Sanhilder's eyes as he said, "To serve a man who knew sending you into hell would trap your souls there when you died. No glorious death in battle with a trip to Valhalla afterwards. Just an eternity of wandering around hell until something finally found and consumed your soul." Sanhilder's body shook slightly as she stared back at Ezekiel. Her lips were pressed tight before she said, "You're lying." Ezekiel shrugged as he asked, "Maybe, maybe not. Are you brave enough to find out the truth?" "Do not question my bravery, mortal. Send me to Asgard and I will find the answers I seek there." Ezekiel shook his head before he said, "I would love to, but you showing up in Asgard would bring attention to me and my friends here. Attention that we currently don't need." Sanhilder crossed her arms over her chest as she asked, "Then how do you expect me to find out the truth? Take your word that what you speak is the truth." Ezekiel weakly smiled as he said, "That would be nice, but I know that's not likely to happen." Ezekiel then smiled normally as he said, "What I can do is show you proof. If you will relax for a moment, I will share with you what we found." Sanhilder didn't have any chance to speak before her eyes lost focus and she started to collapse. Ezekiel easily caught her and placed her back on the bed she awoke from. He glanced at everyone else as he said, "You can go. I'll wait for her to wake up." Tao glanced at Sanhilder and asked, "Do you think that will be enough to convince her?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, but it'll be a good starting point. Next, we'll have to go find Brunhilde. She knows what happened in Asgard, and it's one of the reasons why she left the place. And where exactly is this Brunhilde at? Ezekiel smiled as he said, the trash planet Sakar. Tao raised an eyebrow as she asked, why do you sound excited to go explore a trash planet? Because we can collect a bunch of alien tech while we're there. Maybe even a couple working ships. Tao let out a little sigh before she said, should we really be trying to steal stuff if we're going there to find someone? I never said steal, it's collecting. Ezekiel waved off her concern as he said, plus it'll be fine. Everything on that planet comes from random wormholes. It's pretty much the galaxy's junk drawer. I'll have some of my stronger clones collect stuff as they search for Brunhilde. And how exactly will they be able to collect a ship? I've seen your storage scrolls. They don't have enough room for something like a ship. Agatha asked. Ezekiel smiled as he said, I'm gonna ask Hank if I can borrow a couple of his shrink discs in exchange for some of the alien tech we find. Agatha nodded in understanding as she said, I see. But won't the shrunken object's mass overload the seal's capacity? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, already tested it with my tablet and a few other things. The object's new size is the only thing that matters in the storage process. Plus, the mass of the object changes when shrunken down. But that doesn't make any sense. Where does the weight of the object go? Its overall mass shouldn't change like that. If anything, it should still have the same mass, but it would be more condensed is all. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, it's bullshit science that works like magic as far as I know. I even had my clones do tests with different shrunken objects, and none of the testing results made any sense. Both Tao and Agatha gave Ezekiel a look before he said, what? It literally works like magic. I asked Hank to explain the scientific principles behind it once, and even he didn't sound completely confident in his answers. So as far as I'm concerned, PIM particles are basically bullshit magic. Ezekiel crossed his arms over his chest as he finished talking. Tao and Agatha shared a glance before Tao said, for someone who practices magic, you sure are foolish sometimes. Ezekiel waved them off as he said, then you go talk to Hank. Figure out how it works, then come back here and explain it to me. While you're at it, ask him if we can have some of those shrinking discs too. Tao nodded as she said, fine, I'll be back in a while. After Tao and Agatha left the room, Ezekiel told his clones to let the others know about the upcoming mission to Sakar. Once he was alone, Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and settled down in a chair to work on a coding project. After about an hour, Sandhilder started to stir, so Ezekiel put his tablet away and waited. Once Sandhilder sat up in the bed, Ezekiel asked, have any questions? Sandhilder watched Ezekiel for about half a minute as she collected her thoughts before she asked, what exactly was that? A power of mine. I can use that for a number of different things. This time I used it to share the memories of some friends of mine who recently snuck into Asgard. Sandhilder frowned slightly as she asked, couldn't you just show me whatever you wanted, even if it wasn't true? Ezekiel nodded as he said, you're correct, I could easily do something like that, but that would defeat my purpose of trying to befriend you. Then we are back where we started then. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I don't think so. Sandhilder's eyes narrowed a tiny bit as she asked, what makes you think that? Ezekiel smiled as he said, the fact you didn't jump out of bed and take a defensive stance this time. Sandhilder laughed lightly for a moment before she said, that's because you're the only person here this time. So you kind of trust me now? Sandhilder shook her head as she said, I don't feel threatened by you or the others. Those two women who were here earlier are a different story. Ezekiel smirked as he said, yeah, I guess you have a point. But I take that as a compliment, since part of my training is to seem non-threatening. Sandhilder watched Ezekiel for a few moments before someone knocked at the door. Ezekiel and Sandhilder glanced at the door before Ezekiel said, it's open. The door opened up and in walked Tao, Agatha, and Darren Cross. Sandhilder tensed slightly in bed, but otherwise didn't move from the bed. Ezekiel glanced at Tao and Agatha before his eyes settled on Darren and he asked, good to see you, Darren. What brought you by? Hank told me to join you and pick up a bunch of good tech. Ezekiel glanced at Tao, who shrugged as she said, it was the only way he would let us have some of the shrinking discs. Oh, makes sense, I guess. You do know this will be dangerous, right? Ezekiel asked as he glanced back at Darren. Darren nodded and touched his belt buckle. Within moments, a yellow and black suit covered his whole body. He reached up to his neck and touched a switch there, which collapsed his helmet down, and he said, "I'm still getting used to the suit, but I should be able to stay safe using this." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Good. You'll be assigned to the procurement group." Ezekiel glanced at Sanhilder as he said, "I didn't think you would believe me, so we are going with the backup plan now. Do you want to join us for it?" Sanhilder glanced at everyone before she asked, "Are you taking me to Asgard?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "We are going to find Brunhilde, so she can tell you about Asgard." Sanhilder stood up as she asked, "Brunhilde? She isn't in Asgard?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, she left Asgard a little after your death. She now works as a scrapper on Sakar, and I'm pretty sure she is a complete alcoholic now." Sanhilder glanced at the others before she said, "I would like to join you to find Brunhilde." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Great. If you check the bathroom over there, there is a change of clothes for you. We'll leave once you're ready." 00120. Searching for Scrapper 142. A silver-lined portal opened up in the massive junkyard of Sakar, and out stepped a handful of people. Once through, the portal snapped closed behind them, and the group took a quick glance at their surroundings. Ezekiel grimaced slightly as he said, "This place smells like a dumpster fire." Only two people nodded in agreement, Sanhilder and Darren. The latter of the two quickly used his helmet to help block the smell. Ezekiel glanced at the other people in the group and said, "Let's get to work. Spread out and collect anything that looks useful as we head towards the city." Everyone nodded before they vanished from view. Sanhilder tensed slightly at how quickly they disappeared and the fact she couldn't hear them move at all. Darren glanced around for a moment before he asked, "Will I be able to disappear like that one day?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Yeah, once you get proper training." Holy shit. Ezekiel and Sanhilder turned to look at what gained Darren's attention. Behind them, hovering in the sky, was a huge mass of gray, swirling clouds that covered half of the sky. In the eye of the cloud's vortex was a jet of red color shooting out objects onto the planet's surface. Darren pointed at it in wonder as he said, "That looks like a collapsing neutron star inside of an Einstein-Rosen bridge." "You mean a wormhole?" asked Sanhilder. Darren chuckled before he said, "Yeah? The locals call that one the devil's anus." Darren and Sanhilder both turned to look at Ezekiel, who shrugged as he said, "Don't look at me. I didn't name it." Ezekiel glanced around for a moment before he said, "Let's move out. We're here for a reason." As they started to move, Ezekiel glanced at Darren and said, "Keep your eye out for anything interesting. If you find something, let me know and I'll collect it for you." Darren nodded in reply before he said, "That thing over there looks like some kind of engine. Let's grab it." A few hundred feet ahead of them was a large thruster-like thing attached to a broken wing. As they moved closer to it, Ezekiel and Darren picked up a bunch of smaller objects which Ezekiel sealed into a scroll. Once they reached the engine, Darren shrunk it down with a shrinking disk before Ezekiel sealed it away. For about an hour, Darren, Ezekiel, and his clones collected tons of items as they moved towards the city. Once they got closer to the city, Ezekiel, Darren, and Sanhilder wrapped themselves up in some trash-looking clothing to blend in, while all of the clones used their skills to remain hidden around their group. After another 10 minutes, they made it to the outskirts of the city. It was nothing pretty to look at, mostly half-collapsed shacks made of junk. The people living in the area were malnourished and kept to themselves. Only a few of them cast a fearful glance at the group of three walking past them. Ezekiel didn't like what he was seeing, but they currently couldn't do much to help. Maybe after they set things straight on Earth and cleaned it up, then he could come here and help everyone out. It had nothing to do with the fact the wormholes above the planet littered the planet with free resources. Nope, not at all. He just wanted to help the people here out of the kindness of his heart. After making it through what could only be considered the slums they came to, slightly better slums, the houses were still made of junk and pretty much pieced together. But none of the houses were collapsed, and the people looked a little healthier in this area. As they were walking down one of the larger, empty streets, Ezekiel whispered, "Monkey Scout ahead and find me a terminal I can hack into. Whitefang Scout near the city center and report back with what you find." Darren glanced over to Ezekiel for a moment as if expecting something to happen, before Ezekiel said, "They already left." Darren nodded slightly in response as they kept heading deeper into the city. After 10 minutes or so, someone spoke next to Ezekiel and said, "I found a terminal that should work. It's half a mile ahead inside of a building." "Good, show us the way." A man in all-black tactical gear with a white and red monkey mask appeared in front of Ezekiel and said, "Follow me." Both Darren and Sanhilder jumped back when the man appeared, but Darren was more from fright, while Sanhilder was from her reflexes. Ezekiel cast a smirk at both of them as he said, "Don't worry, no one will hurt you with me around. I don't need your protection, Midgardian," Sanhilder said as she crossed her arms over her chest. Darren just nodded as he said, "Thanks. Hank's only given me a crash course with the suit. I'm not sure if I could properly protect myself with it." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Sorry about that. Lead the way, Monkey." The group made faster time as they followed behind Monkey, who quickly led them to the building he was talking about and the terminal he found. Once their monkey disappeared from view and Ezekiel started looking at the terminal for a few moments, before he pulled out a scroll and removed a set of tools from it. As Ezekiel used a pry bar to rip off one of the terminal's panels, he said, "Make sure no one interrupts me. This will take me a little while." Sanhilder nodded along with Darren, who moved to stand somewhat in front of Ezekiel as he started to pull wires out from under the terminal. He took out his tools and started to test different wires, looking for which ones were for data. After 5 minutes, he was able to find 3 different data wires, so he stripped them and plugged them into one of his docks. After connecting his tablet into the dock, a couple people walked into the room they were in. The one in the front said something in a language no one could understand before him, and his companion dropped to the ground with a thud. Monkey stood behind their bodies and nodded before he disappeared again. As Ezekiel was typing on his tablet, he said, "Darren, move their bodies out of the way in case more people show up." Darren hesitated as he asked, "Did Monkey kill them?" Ezekiel glanced up as he said, "Why would he kill them? They weren't really a threat." "Oh, okay," Darren said as he moved closer to the 2 people on the ground. It took him about a minute to move both bodies out of the way and kinda hide them out of sight from the doorway. Afterwards, he moved back in front of Ezekiel. After another 5 minutes, White Fong appeared next to Ezekiel and said, "I found a few terminals near the city center. I also scouted out part of the palace and Colosseum. Inside the palace is the main ship hangar. We should be able to collect some spaceships from there." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Good. Let's head that way then. This terminal is only for this building and doesn't hold much information." Ezekiel quickly disconnected his hub and tablet before placing it in his storage scroll. After collecting his tools, Ezekiel said, "Lead the way, White Fong." The group left the building and made quick time through the city towards the palace area. They passed a few different areas on the way, and everything shared one thing in common. It was all pieced together from many different parts. Even when they arrived near the palace and Colosseum, the 2 buildings definitely looked better than everything else, but they were still pieced together from scrap. White Fong led the group to one of the side entrances of the palace where a couple guards stood watch. As the group approached, one of the guards glanced over before he said, "That's far enough. State your business here." It didn't sound exactly like English, but it was close enough. The guards most likely had some kind of translation device with them, or at least that's what Ezekiel thought. Ezekiel smiled at the guards as he said with a sound-based Ninjutsu, "Don't mind us, we're just passing through." "What are?" Both guards' eyes unfocused before the lead one stepped out of the way and said, "Sorry, sir. Your group is free to enter." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Thanks and keep up the good work." The guard smiled as he said, "Thank you, sir." Ezekiel and his group moved past the guards, and within a few moments were out of sight of them. After a few minutes, both guards came out of the Jinjutsu and looked around for a moment, slightly confused. When they saw no one around them, they moved back to their post. By that point, Ezekiel was already in a room and working on connecting to a new terminal. As the rest of his group watched the door to the room, in case someone came in. As Ezekiel worked, Sanhilder asked, "Are you sure Brunhilde is living in a place like this?" "Pretty sure. I mean, there's a small chance that she isn't here, but I'm 99% sure she's currently living on Sakar. Why would she choose to live in a place like this?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Well, the main reason is you can't really leave this place. As for how she got here, I have no idea. About 10 minutes passed as Ezekiel worked on his tablet before he said, "Found her. She lives in a building close by on floor 20, room 2037. Sanhildr looked at Ezekiel as she asked, "You're positive it's her?" Ezekiel lifted up his tablet to show a picture on Brunhilde's ID in the computer system. It displayed her picture, the ship she used, and her name as Scrapper 142. As he showed it to Sanhildr, he asked, "You tell me, does this look like her?" Sanhildr's eyes were locked on the picture as she nodded. Ezekiel smiled as he started to disconnect his tablet and connection hub as he said, "Good. Let's go meet her." The system said she was currently located in her room. As Ezekiel stored his equipment away in a scroll, he said, "Darren, I want you to go to the hangar with White Fong and Yellow Flash to collect some ships. You can just shrink down and one of them will carry you to the hangar, so you don't have to deal with security." Darren nodded as he asked, "What ships should we get?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "The best ones, of course." Darren nodded slightly as he asked, "And how exactly am I going to figure out which ones are the best or better than others? I don't know what or how I could even compare them for that matter." Ezekiel waved him off as he said, "Just use the rule of cool." Rule of cool? Yeah. If it looks cool, it probably is cool. Ezekiel said as if that explained everything. Darren shook his head as he said, "That doesn't make any sense. What I define as cool won't necessarily be what you consider cool." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "It doesn't need to. Just grab all the ships you can and make sure that they look cool." Darren let out a tired sigh before he asked, "How many should I grab? How many shrink discs do you have left?" Darren looked into a pouch he wore on his hip before he said, "About 20. Then get about 20 ships." "Won't the alarms go off after the first ship disappears?" Darren asked. "Probably. So just plan ahead and be fast about the whole thing. Once you're done, Yellow Flash will take care of the rest." Darren nodded as he said, "All right, anything else before we leave?" "Make sure the ships are clear of people before you shrink them. I don't want any guests when we get back home." Ezekiel glanced at everyone once before he said, "All right, let's move out."